Howdy, folks. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, The Mighty Bjorn, and today for you, I'm going to be taking time doing a bit of a tabletop gaming video because I am actually going to be doing a review of the G.I. Joe tabletop role-playing game from Renegade Game Studios. Now, this is the same company that also has created a Transformers TTRPG as well as a Power Rangers TTRPG, which I'll be discussing a little bit more later in this video. But it runs on the Essence 20 system, the same as the other two games that I had mentioned. So, with that being said, it is going to require a full set of D20 dice. Also, with those, while you're playing the game, you're going to kind of feel the ghost of 5th edition D&D on your neck. And, well, that's because at its core, this is actually based off of the 5th edition D&D system from Wizards of the Coast, but there's also many changes that they've actually made in the game itself to kind of give it a different feel, a bit of a uniqueness to it, if you will. Anyway, let's really dive into it here. And I think the place to really start with is the character creation. So, the character creation itself will seem complex up front. It's a 7-step process, and it can be quite a lengthy process. But with that being said, it's something very familiar to Star Trek Adventures, where you're selecting an influence, selecting a background, selecting a role, selecting an origin, you're setting your skill points, you're setting your ability points, etc. And that's going to influence your overall character build. We'll start with influences, and influence is essentially what is the character's background outside of the military, if you will. What background do they have? What do they pursue? You know, thrill seeker is a great example. Basically, it's you're a thrill seeker. You like to go parachute diving and different types of stuff like that. Or another one is martial artist within your background, your influences that kind of will shape what your character's like and different things that they do. Now, the next step is origin. This is essentially your branch of service before becoming a Joe. That's if you do have a branch of service. I'll get into a little bit more of that here in a bit. But essentially, you select a branch of service and then you select an MOS, or basically what your job was within the military. So if you pick the Army as your branch of service and you select pilot, well, then more than likely you're going to be a helicopter pilot. You could also be a tanker, an infantryman, etc. And then if you go with the Navy, you could end up being a corpsman, which is essentially a Marine medic or a medic in general within the Navy, even though the Marine also, or the Army also has their own medics. Now, there is some options that's outside of the military, such as engineers and different things of that nature, but there's not too many, but at least there's a few, and they somehow end up working out in great ways if you wanted to do that and become essentially a G.I. Joe, if you will. Now, with that being said, then the next thing you're going to set is your roles. And essentially, your roles is your class. It's infantry, commando, ranger, technician, and so on. There's 7 different ones that you can pick from that you can kind of work with. And like I said, they're more or less your classes. And it's going to take and make an effect on your perk points, your ability scores, your skill points, etc. It's going to make little tweaks and changes here and there. If I remember correctly, the role was also what set your hit points. Now, the next thing I really want to cover is the equipment. And, well, the equipment is kind of generic. Now, there is some more special pieces of equipment in there, such as the body armor gets a little bit special. And there are certain gadgets and gear that's got special rules to them, things of that nature. But realistically, like the weapons is done in a very generic way. Now, with that being said, though, they're also very upgradable. So if you want to make a high-speed, low-drag M4A1, well, the stuff is there for you to do it. There's also pets available in the game, which I think is very cool. If anybody who remembers, there was actually a G.I. Joe that had a German Shepherd. I think if I remember correctly, it was Law and Order was the characters. I don't quite remember what the character's names was, but he was an Army MP that was part of G.I. Joe. There's also rules there for drones, as well as a decent amount of vehicles. It's not all the different vehicles is there, but pretty good baseline amount of vehicles for you to use in your G.I. Joe campaign. There is also a very good variety of generic enemies, and a lot of the generic enemies has different variations. So you could do different builds. You can kind of enhance them a bit to make them a bit more challenging. You could swap out bits of gear to make them fit certain rules a little bit better. So that's kind of a nice thing you got going there. Instead of having just like a huge section of different enemies, they essentially, it's like there's like a dozen different types of enemies in there, but then all those different enemies have variations to them as well. The book also does have some unique characters, such as Baroness is in there, Cobra Commander is in there, Major Blood is in there. There's a few different of unique characters in there. So with all that being said, I feel generally what I covered here of the book is actually pretty good overall. But with that being said, the game is not without its flaws. The skill system is a little wonky. Basically, you're taking a d20 plus something else, and you're going to roll them together to get a result. But if you have a specialization, then you have to roll additional dice. And basically, it comes down to is you got to take and figure out what exactly kind of actions the players are taking. So they have to be very descriptive, role play out what actions they're doing. And that's going to pretty much influence what kind of die roll they're making. And that can be a little wonky to deal with, especially when you're new to the game. And it can be very complex. It's not so bad if you're a little bit more experienced at tabletop role-playing games, but it's still a little wonky because it's essentially it can bog down the game when you're trying to figure out what skills does what dice needs to be rolled, when you're coming up with the totals, when you're coming up with the die check, the whole 9 yards. It can really slow down gameplay at times. The next thing that can really slow down gameplay is combat. Now, with that being said, it's kind of a good, bad thing. It's a double-edged sword. The combat in the G.I. Joe tabletop role-playing game has a lot of complexity to it, and that's because you have to figure vehicles, there's aircraft, you got infantry, anti-tank systems, and all kinds of other different stuff. And it basically, combat can get really bogged down at times when you're trying to figure out everything that's going on in combat, the different actions, what action is what type of action, what's in it. Well, attack actions are the easy ones, and so is move actions. But there's just a lot of variation in there that you got to deal with. And this game actually has a flow of combat chart that you can download from Renegade Game Studios. With that being said, I've played a lot of role-playing games over the years, and I've never had a flow of combat chart nor needed a flow of combat chart for any of them. So it's a little disconcerting when you need a flow of combat chart just to do your combat. And I feel the way the combat is and how it can get bogged down is realistically kind of a disservice to the game itself and what kind of game it is. I mean, it's G.I. Joe, it's flashy, it's a lot of action, a lot of pew, 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 and instead you get moments you're just kind of sitting there staring at each other for 10 minutes trying to figure out exactly what's going on and what rules are being placed and what modifiers needs to be added to the different types of roles, who's doing what counts as cover, what counts as having height advantage, so on and so forth. Now, with that being said, we're going to move on. My next chief complaint of the G.I. Joe TTRPG is the book feels incomplete at times. Now, I'm going to admit, I know game companies does this stuff on purpose, and that's because they want to create supplements. They want to make additional books, so that way their game systems are making additional money. And it's not a huge thing. Don't get me wrong. It's an almost 400-page book, and they did a really good job with what they did within those 400 pages. But at times, it still feels incomplete, and it kind of feels necessary to actually have some of the supplement books, such as, do you need a piece of real high tech equipment for your mission? Well, that probably means you need the Quartermaster's Guide. Want to play as someone from Cobra, or even a Cobra Renegade, if you will? Well, you're going to need the the Cobra Codex. Now, the one thing I do think is really cool that they have in this system is they actually have a book for doing crossover type stuff, which is, well, as you can see here, here's G.I. Joe and Transformers, and there's actually a series currently running again within the comic book genre of G.I. Joe and Transformers, another G.I. Joe Transformer crossover. And they actually have a book, Field Guide to Action and Adventure, that lets you actually do crossovers with their other games. So you could do like G.I. Joe and Power Rangers, or you can do Transformers and Power Rangers, or obviously Transformers and G.I. Joe, which is the primary influence for this. I think that's actually a cool supplement for this game. I'm not really doing a review for it, but I want to put it out there because it's nice that there's actually a guide to help kind of square up or situate, or I'm not quite sure how to put it. I would say situate how you would want to do a crossover between the two games. So, what's my final thoughts about the G.I. Joe TTRPG? Well, I'm actually very mixed about this game. It's not a bad game, and their presentation, in my opinion, is really well done. But as I'm sitting here and I look at the complexity and I look at the different things that can bog down the game, it really makes me question if it's worth playing the game, especially because of the fact that at times it feels like an incomplete game. I would say if you really, really, really want to do a G.I. Joe TTRPG, I think there's better options out there. I mean, one I've looked at was Freedom Force, which I still may end up getting Freedom Force. I haven't taken the plunge yet to get it. But Freedom Force looks like an interesting opportunity for a generic G.I. Joe TTRPG. But with that being said, if you already have the other Renegade Game Studios role-playing games, such as Transformers or Power Rangers, or both for what it matters, then yeah, I would definitely take the plunge to get the G.I. Joe TTRPG. That's if you like those systems. If you don't like those systems, I would stay away from this. If you like 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, then you'll probably like this, but there's also a lot of differences that might turn you off a little bit. But you're more than likely going to like this. That being said, if you don't like 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, then I would totally not recommend this game. So it's kind of a double-edged sword here of, I feel very middle of the road about this game. And personally, I don't highly recommend this game. That's nothing against Renegade Game Studios. That's more or less my opinion and my taste and what I'm looking for in a TTRPG. And this G.I. Joe just doesn't really have it for me. Anyway, folks, with all that being said, hopefully you all enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for tuning in, and have yourself a wonderful day.